Number 10. The children of God. Some destructive movements become infamous because of a single massacre or a final dramatic collapse. Others are more disturbing because the ruin unfolds slowly, intimately, and across generations. The children of God belong to that second category. Their story is not simply about a fringe religious group with strange doctrines. It is about what happens when absolute spiritual authority enters the family, the body, sexuality, and childhood itself. Founded in the late 1960s by David Berg, the movement emerged out of the atmosphere of counterculture, rebellion, and spiritual experimentation that defined the era. At first glance, it could be mistaken for one more radical religious community rejecting materialism, conventional society, and the failures of the modern world. That is often how such movements gain their first momentum. They present themselves as alternatives to corruption, hypocrisy, or spiritual emptiness. They offer certainty, intimacy, belonging, and the promise of a truer way to live. But that promise can become extraordinarily dangerous once the leader's word begins replacing every other source of moral judgment. Under Berg, the children of God developed into a movement structured around charismatic domination, apocalyptic messaging, sexual control, and the steady erosion of boundaries that most societies treat as protective and non-negotiable. In groups like this, transgression is often recoded as revelation. What would once have been seen as exploitation is reinterpreted as obedience. Shame becomes proof that a follower is still too worldly. Resistance becomes rebellion against divine purpose. Once a belief system learns how to do that, it can justify almost anything. That is what made the children of God so destructive. The movement did not only isolate followers from the outside world, it reshaped internal realities so thoroughly that exploitation could be spiritualized and harm could be taught as love, sacrifice, or liberation. The later notoriety surrounding sexual abuse, coercive practices, and the treatment of children was not an accidental corruption of an otherwise healthy system. It was the logical result of a structure in which one man's claimed revelation overruled ordinary conscience. The group's evolution over time only deepened the tragedy. Rebranding, internal shifts, public exposure, and attempts at reform could not erase the damage because the deepest wound was not about image. It was about lives shaped in an enclosed world where authority had learned how to invade the most vulnerable parts of being human. People raised within such movements do not simply leave with a changed opinion. They often leave carrying damaged trust, broken identity, and the long afterlife of having been taught that abuse was sacred. That is why the children of God belong on this list. Their ruin was not a single fiery ending that history could neatly isolate. It was a prolonged moral collapse inside a system of belief that weaponized devotion, intimacy, and dependency. The movement showed how cultic power becomes most dangerous when it stops asking only for loyalty and starts claiming ownership over the emotional, sexual, and familial core of life itself. And perhaps that is what makes the case so chilling. Some movements destroy openly. Others do it by persuading the people inside that destruction is holiness, and by the time the language breaks, entire lives have already been rearranged around the lie. Number 9. The Dancing Plague of 1518. Some movements lead people into ruin through leadership, doctrine, and control. The Dancing Plague of 1518 feels stranger because it seems to reveal a collective breakdown without a single obvious prophet at the center, a moment when belief, fear, the body, and social contagion fused into something so irrational that history still struggles to decide whether it was madness, illness, ritual panic, or all of them at once. In Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, people reportedly began dancing in the streets in a manner that did not resemble celebration. One woman started, then others joined, and before long the phenomenon had spread into a wider crisis. The dancing continued compulsively, obsessively, and destructively, with accounts describing participants collapsing from exhaustion and physical strain. Even if later retellings amplified certain details, the core event remains one of the most unsettling episodes in early modern European history. What gives the incident its power is that it sits at the intersection of belief and embodiment. This was not merely an idea people discussed. It was a behavior that seized the body and made social panic visible through movement itself. In a world already shaped by religious anxiety, hardship, illness, and collective stress, such an event would not have been experienced as meaningless. It would have entered a symbolic universe already crowded with divine punishment, curses, saintly power, communal guilt, and fear of forces moving through human flesh. That is why the dancing plague belongs in this countdown, even though it does not fit the usual cult structure neatly. It reveals how belief can become ruinous even without a formal sect if an entire population is primed to interpret suffering through a charged spiritual and psychological frame. Once people begin responding not only to what they see, but to what they believe the event means, panic acquires reinforcement. The body is no longer just the site of distress. It becomes the medium through which shared dread spreads. The reaction of authorities only deepened the tragedy. Attempts to manage the crisis reportedly included responses that, from a modern perspective, seemed disastrously misguided, including allowing or even facilitating more dancing under the assumption that the condition had to be exhausted out of the sufferers. That detail matters because it shows how communal belief can distort intervention. When the explanatory model is wrong, the cure can become part of the catastrophe. Theories have multiplied ever since: poisoned rye, mass psychogenic illness, religious frenzy, stress response in a deeply burdened society. None of them fully empties the event of its unease, because the strangeness lies not only in what caused the dancing, but in what kind of world made such an outbreak possible. This was a society in which anxiety, hunger, disease, spiritual fear, and fragile public order could align until behavior itself became epidemic. That is what makes the dancing plague feel so darkly relevant to this video. It shows that ruin does not always require an organized cult with a charismatic leader. Sometimes a culture under enough tension can generate its own temporary prison of meaning, one in which suffering becomes contagious because the community already possesses a framework ready to receive and amplify it. And that is why the event still haunts history. The dancers of 1518 did not march into destruction under a formal banner. They moved into it through collective breakdown, through a society so strained and symbolically charged that the line between inner terror and public ritual seemed to dissolve in the streets. Number 8. Aum Shinrikyo. Some destructive movements collapse inward and destroy mainly the people trapped inside them. Aum Shinrikyo became one of the most terrifying examples of modern ruin because it crossed another threshold entirely. It did not stop at cultic control, apocalyptic belief, and internal abuse. It turned spiritual certainty into organized mass violence. Founded in Japan by Shoko Asahara, Aum began by presenting itself through the language many dangerous movements use at the start: enlightenment, higher consciousness, purification, hidden truth, and escape from a corrupt world. For followers disillusioned with modern life, that language could feel profound rather than sinister. A group that promises awakening rarely announces at the beginning that it is building the moral machinery for murder. It builds that machinery slowly, by redefining reality until compassion itself becomes subordinate to doctrine. That is what made Aum so dangerous. It fused religious ambition, apocalyptic expectation, pseudo-scientific obsession, and authoritarian control into a system that increasingly saw the outside world not as mistaken, but as spiritually disposable. Once a movement reaches that point, violence no longer feels like violation to the people directing it. It begins to feel like necessity. Enemies become obstacles to cosmic renewal. Doubt becomes contamination. Killing can be reframed as purification. The group's internal evolution showed exactly how modern cultic ruin can intensify under pressure. Aum was not anti-modern in the simple sense. It absorbed technology, chemistry, media strategy, and organizational discipline into its worldview. That combination is what made it uniquely frightening. Earlier destructive sects might rely on isolation alone. Aum attempted something colder, the industrialization of delusion. Laboratories, weapons programs, experimentation, secrecy, and doctrinal fanaticism all began serving the same apocalyptic vision. The 1995 sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway fixed Aum forever in global memory. But the horror did not begin there. By the time that attack took place, the movement had already crossed countless internal moral lines. Murder, coercion, abuse, imprisonment, fear, and totalizing control had become part of the structure. The subway attack mattered historically because it revealed to the wider world what had been growing inside the movement all along, a cult that no longer saw any boundary between its mystical fantasies and the right to inflict indiscriminate death on ordinary people. This is why Aum belongs so high on the list. It exposed one of the bleakest truths about destructive belief, that spiritual language can coexist with extreme technical competence, and that modern education does not automatically protect a society from apocalyptic capture. In some cases, it may even supply new tools to the captured mind. Aum did not look like medieval fanaticism, wearing old clothes. It looked like late modernity, feeding its own nightmares into a cult until the result became chemically lethal. And that is why the movement still feels so chilling. It showed that ruin can arrive not only through emotional manipulation or isolated mass death, but through a belief system that learns how to weaponize science, bureaucracy, and urban anonymity in the service of spiritual catastrophe. Number 7. The Branch Davidians at Waco. Some movements lead people into ruin through a final act of self-destruction. Others become catastrophic because the closed world of belief collides with the armed power of the state, and once that collision begins, every side helps push the ending toward disaster. The Branch Davidians at Waco remain one of the most disturbing examples of this pattern. The community at Mount Carmel near Waco, Texas, did not emerge from nowhere. It grew out of a longer Adventist offshoot tradition already shaped by prophetic expectation, scriptural intensity, and the conviction that history was moving toward apocalyptic resolution. Under David Koresh, those pressures intensified dramatically. Koresh did not present himself as merely one interpreter among many. He placed himself at the center of meaning, as the one who could unlock prophecy, define obedience, and determine the spiritual role of the people around him. That shift is essential. A movement becomes especially dangerous when the leader no longer teaches a worldview from inside the group, but becomes the living key to reality itself. Once that happens, followers do not merely agree with doctrine. They begin orienting conscience, loyalty, fear, and salvation around a single human voice. In such systems, contradiction from outside rarely weakens the leader. It often strengthens him. Persecution becomes proof. Scrutiny becomes prophecy fulfilled. That is what made Waco so combustible. The Branch Davidians were not simply a fringe congregation with unconventional beliefs. They were a sealed apocalyptic community built around a leader whose authority depended on escalating separation from the outside world. The more tension gathered, the easier it became for both the group and outside authorities to interpret events through hardening frameworks. For the state, danger and illegality had to be confronted. For the believers inside, confrontation could be absorbed into an already powerful end-times script. The federal raid and siege transformed a dangerous religious structure into a full historical catastrophe. Once violence entered openly, the situation became more than law enforcement. It became symbolic warfare. Every day of the siege intensified mutual certainty. The authorities saw a manipulative armed leader with vulnerable people inside. The Davidians saw mounting evidence that the outer world really was closing in, as their theology had warned. In conflicts like this, time does not always cool extremity. It can radicalize interpretation on every side. The final fire made Waco permanent in the historical imagination, but the deeper tragedy is that the ruin had begun long before the flames, long before the compound burned. A structure of obedience, isolation, sexual control, prophetic absolutism, and spiritual dependency had already been built. That structure is what made it possible for the siege to end as horribly as it did. The fire was the visible end. The invisible end had been taking shape in doctrine and authority for much longer. That is why Waco belongs here. It shows that cultic ruin does not always stay contained inside the movement itself. Sometimes it expands outward until the state enters the drama, and when both apocalyptic belief and coercive power harden at the same time, the result can become almost impossible to pull back from. And perhaps that is what makes Waco endure so painfully. It was not simply a story of believers destroyed by faith, nor simply of a community destroyed by force. It was a story of a closed prophetic world becoming real enough and dangerous enough that when confrontation came, history no longer had any clean way to prevent the ending from becoming infernal. Number 6. The Millerite Great Disappointment. Some movements lead people into ruin through violence, isolation, or a leader's direct abuse. The Millerite movement became destructive in a different and, in some ways, more haunting way. It drew thousands of people toward ruin not by demanding blood at the start, but by persuading them that history itself had a date and that everything ordinary would soon become irrelevant. In the early 19th century, William Miller, a Baptist lay preacher and interpreter of biblical prophecy, became convinced that Christ would return within a calculable time frame. His conclusions spread widely across the United States at a moment when religious revivalism, reform energy, and apocalyptic expectation were already alive in the culture. This was the perfect environment for certainty to grow. The movement did not begin as madness to those inside it. It began as seriousness. Scripture was being examined. Patterns were being recognized. The world, with all its corruption and instability, suddenly seemed to fit into a divine timetable. That is what made the Millerite movement so powerful. It offered not merely hope, but schedule. Many belief systems promise meaning. A prophecy movement that claims to know when the final transformation will occur offers something far more intoxicating. It does not just explain suffering. It tells believers that suffering is almost over, that their generation stands at the hinge of all time, and that every sacrifice made now will soon be vindicated in absolute terms. Once a movement reaches that point, normal life begins to lose authority. Property, profession, reputation, future planning, all can begin to feel secondary to the approaching end. Not every follower responded with the same intensity, and later caricatures often oversimplified what happened. But the emotional logic was the same throughout the movement. If history is about to close, then earthly prudence starts looking like spiritual weakness. That is one of the most dangerous transformations belief can produce. It does not always need physical coercion. It can make self-disruption feel righteous. The date eventually settled around October 22nd, 1844. That detail matters because the closer prophecy moves toward a deadline, the more total its hold can become. A vague apocalypse can coexist with ordinary life for years. A specific date forces reality toward collision. As the appointed time approached, expectation intensified. And then, of course, nothing happened. The moment after that failure is what turned the movement into one of history's great case studies in ruin. The event became known as the Great Disappointment, and the name is almost too gentle for the emotional collapse it represents. For many believers, the issue was not merely that a prediction had been wrong. The issue was that they had reordered inner life around certainty, and reality had refused to ratify it. Shame, confusion, ridicule, grief, and theological shock all followed. Some abandoned the movement entirely. Others reinterpreted the prophecy, moving the fulfillment from visible earthly event into heavenly process or symbolic transition. In that way, the failure did not end belief. It fractured it and forced it into new forms. That is why the Millerites belong on this list. Their ruin was not a massacre or a siege. It was a mass spiritual collision with unfulfilled certainty. The movement showed how a system of belief can damage lives even without overt physical violence, when it teaches people to detach from ordinary judgment in preparation for an ending that never arrives. And perhaps that is what makes the Great Disappointment so enduringly sad. It reveals that people do not need to be dragged into ruin by obvious evil. Sometimes they walk into it carrying scripture, sincerity, and the belief that the date has finally been revealed. Number 5. Heaven's Gate. Some destructive movements are rooted in ancient scriptures or political revolution. Heaven's Gate became one of the most unsettling cult tragedies of the modern age because it translated old religious longings into the language of cosmic escape, technological transcendence, and voluntary disappearance from the human world. Led by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, the movement developed a worldview in which earthly life was not the true destination, but a lower stage to be abandoned in preparation for a higher existence. That belief was framed through a strange fusion of Christian motifs, apocalyptic expectation, New Age concepts, extraterrestrial imagery, and the conviction that the human body itself was only a temporary vehicle. This is what gave Heaven's Gate its peculiar power. It did not simply condemn the world as sinful, it treated the world as obsolete. That difference matters. In many destructive groups, followers are taught that the world is evil, fallen, or persecuting them. In Heaven's Gate, the world was also framed as inferior, a level to be exited, transcended, left behind in favor of a higher evolutionary destiny. Once a movement convinces people that the self is trapped inside a disposable biological shell, death can be reinterpreted with terrifying ease. It stops looking like annihilation and starts looking like transfer. This is why the group became so dangerous. The movement did not rely only on fear. It relied on purification, detachment, discipline, and the gradual stripping away of ordinary identity. Personal history, sexuality, attachment, family bonds, even the body's natural claims were subordinated to the mission of becoming ready. That readiness was not symbolic. It was trained. The group cultivated a culture in which surrender of self was not treated as loss, but as progress. The more thoroughly one emptied oneself of ordinary humanity, the more spiritually advanced one was believed to become. The approach of the Hale-Bopp comet in 1997 gave this worldview its final catastrophic focus, the belief that a spacecraft was accompanying the comet and that departure from Earth required leaving the body turned doctrine into action. The mass suicide that followed shocked the world not only because of its scale, but because of its eerie composure. The identical clothing, the ritual order, the calm preparation, all of it suggested not chaotic panic, but total belief carried to its final consequence. That composure is what makes Heaven's Gate so chilling in retrospect. Many people expect ruin to look wild, violent, or confused. Here it looked organized, sincere, almost serene from the inside. That is often the most frightening form a destructive belief system can take. The people involved did not see themselves as dying in despair. They saw themselves as graduating. That inversion is the essence of cultic danger. It transforms self-erasure into achievement. Heaven's Gate also revealed how adaptable destructive belief can be in the modern world. This was not a medieval sect waiting for fire from heaven. It was a movement shaped by media, consumer culture, science fiction imagery, and the spiritual hunger of late modernity. Its members lived in the same technological world as everyone else. What separated them was not ignorance of modern life, but a complete reinterpretation of what modern life meant and what escape from it required. And that is why Heaven's Gate belongs this high on the list. It showed that ruin can arrive not only through coercion and fear, but through a worldview so total that followers come to see their own extinction as an intelligent, disciplined, even beautiful act of obedience. In the end, the movement did not need to physically force people toward death in the crudest sense. It did something more devastating. It taught them to believe that leaving the world behind was the clearest proof they had finally understood it. Number 4. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. Some destructive movements stay on the margins of society, feeding on a few thousand followers before collapsing inward. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom became something far more terrifying because belief did not remain small. It became state-like, military, expansionist, and apocalyptic, on a scale vast enough to drag an empire into one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. In the mid-19th century, Hong Xiuquan emerged from a world already under immense strain. Qing China was burdened by social unrest, economic pressure, ethnic tension, foreign intrusion, and the slow corrosion of confidence in the ruling order. In such conditions, visions do not stay private for long if they attach themselves to existing grievance. Hong's religious claims, including the conviction that he had a divine mission and a special relationship to the Christian God, did not merely offer consolation. They offered reversal. They told the disordered world that its suffering had meaning, its rulers were illegitimate, and a purified kingdom was not only coming, but could be built by force. That is what made the Taiping movement so dangerous. It fused spiritual revelation with political revolution so completely that compromise became almost impossible. Once a movement believes it is not only right, but divinely authorized to replace the world around it, ordinary restraints begin to collapse. Violence is no longer merely strategic, it becomes sacred necessity. Enemies are not just opponents, they are obstacles to heaven on earth. This is why the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom belongs so high on this list. It was not a doomed commune or an isolated sect waiting for the end. It became a rival order with armies, administration, doctrine, territory, internal hierarchy, and an absolute claim to moral legitimacy. That expansion is crucial. Belief turned into government, but it remained cultic in the most dangerous sense. The leader's authority rested on revelation. The social world was reordered by rigid ideological demands. Dissent became treason not only against the movement, but against divine purpose. The result was catastrophic. Civil war spread across China with appalling force. Cities fell, populations were displaced or annihilated. The death toll climbed into numbers so vast that the conflict now stands among the greatest human disasters in recorded history. And at the center of it all remained a movement whose internal logic had already made moderation almost unthinkable. Once heavenly certainty and worldly power joined, ruin expanded outward with extraordinary speed. The internal contradictions only deepened the tragedy. Movements that promise purity often rot from within as soon as they gain real power. Court intrigue, factional struggle, authoritarian discipline, hypocrisy, and terror all began eating into the Taiping order from the inside. That pattern matters because it reveals one of history's most repeated lessons. A belief system that claims to redeem the world by total moral control often begins reproducing violence even before its enemies destroy it. And that is why the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom remains one of the darkest examples of belief leading people into ruin. It showed what happens when prophetic certainty stops being merely persuasive and becomes sovereign. Once that happens, the movement no longer destroys only believers. It starts consuming provinces, cities, armies, and whole civilian populations in the name of a salvation that keeps receding behind the next wave of blood. Number 3. The Order of the Solar Temple. Some destructive movements ruin lives through public fanaticism and open confrontation. The Order of the Solar Temple was more unsettling because it clothed catastrophe in refinement, secrecy, and spiritual elevation. It did not present itself as raw extremism. It presented itself as initiation, hidden knowledge, cosmic destiny, and elite transcendence. That made the descent into death even more chilling. Founded in the 1980s by Joseph DiMambro and Luc Jouret, the Order of the Solar Temple combined esoteric mysticism, New Age spirituality, apocalyptic expectation, and pseudo-chivalric symbolism into a worldview that made followers feel chosen rather than simply obedient. That distinction is important. Many cults gain power by demanding submission. Others gain power by flattering the believer's sense of special access. The Solar Temple offered initiation into a higher order of truth. It taught members not only that the world was spiritually compromised, but that they stood apart from it in a way that made ordinary moral limits feel increasingly irrelevant. This is what made the movement so dangerous. It turned elitism into devotion. Members were not simply told to believe. They were encouraged to see themselves as participants in a hidden cosmic drama, one involving purification, transition, and ultimate passage beyond the degraded conditions of earthly life. Once a group begins speaking that way, death itself becomes vulnerable to reinterpretation. It no longer appears as failure. It becomes transformation. The horror of the Solar Temple emerged in stages, through ritualized deaths, murder, staged scenes, and the shocking discovery that what had been framed as spiritual passage included coercion, execution, and the killing of people who had not chosen their end freely. This is what strips away any romantic language the movement tried to build around itself. Whatever talk of transition or sacred departure surrounded it, the reality was not transcendence. It was manipulation weaponized into death, with theatrical symbolism layered over the crime. That theatricality matters. The Order of the Solar Temple understood image. Ceremonial atmosphere, symbolic language, occult prestige, and carefully managed impression all helped sustain the illusion that the group operated on a plane above ordinary life. This is one reason its collapse remains so disturbing. The movement did not descend into chaos in a visibly crude way. It tried to aestheticize ruin, to make death appear meaningful, chosen and cosmically ordered even when violence and control were shaping the outcome beneath the surface. The broader cultural setting also intensified the case. This was a late 20th century movement speaking to people in societies often imagined as rational, prosperous, and stable. The Solar Temple reminded the modern world that apocalyptic capture does not require poverty, obvious ignorance, or social marginality in the simplest sense. A destructive belief system can grow among educated adults through the language of spiritual depth, therapeutic searching, and elite initiation just as easily as through raw fear. And that is why the Order of the Solar Temple belongs at number 3. It revealed one of the most disturbing forms ruin can take. Not noisy collective frenzy, but composed, spiritualized death arranged under the language of ascent, as if violence could be purified by symbolism and murder could be made to look like transcendence. In the end, the movement did not merely lead people away from reality. It led them into a chamber where secrecy, elitism, ritual, and apocalypse had fused so completely that the difference between enlightenment and annihilation was deliberately made impossible to see until it was far too late. Number 2. The Münster Anabaptist Kingdom. Some destructive movements end in private compounds or remote communities. The Münster Anabaptist Kingdom became one of history's most terrifying examples of belief leading people into ruin because it seized an actual city and tried to turn apocalyptic certainty into public government. In the 1530s, the city of Münster in present-day Germany became the center of a radical Anabaptist takeover during an age already burning with religious upheaval. The Reformation had shattered old certainties, authority was contested at every level, and Europe was full of people convinced that divine history was accelerating toward a final confrontation. In such an atmosphere, a movement did not need to sound absurd to gain followers. It only needed to sound more certain than the frightened world around it. That is what made Münster so dangerous. The movement did not simply preach reform. It claimed sacred legitimacy for total transformation. Once radical leaders and believers took control of the city, ordinary political life began to give way to apocalyptic rule. Property could be redefined. Obedience could be intensified. Dissent could be treated not as disagreement, but as rebellion against God's unfolding kingdom. A community stops being a city in the normal sense when it starts believing it is the chosen stage for the end of history. This is why Münster belongs so high on this list. It was not a mere theological dispute that spiraled out of control. It was a moment when prophetic certainty hardened into urban power. The city became a laboratory for theocratic absolutism, and once that happened, coercion followed naturally. Leaders imposed rigid control, intensified discipline, and reshaped social life according to a revelation they claimed was above any external correction. In such worlds, ideology does not remain abstract. It enters food, property, sex, punishment, and death. The siege that followed only deepened the catastrophe. Surrounded by hostile forces, cut off from ordinary exit, and increasingly driven inward by both deprivation and conviction, Münster became exactly the kind of closed, apocalyptic world that history has repeatedly shown to be lethal. The more the outside threatened destruction, the more the inner leadership could frame suffering as confirmation. This is one of the oldest and most dangerous feedback loops in radical belief. Pressure from outside does not always weaken the movement. It often proves it, at least to those already trapped within. What followed was ruin in every sense. Hunger, terror, authoritarian rule, religious extremity, and final violent collapse turned Münster into one of the most infamous warnings of the Reformation era. The kingdom did not merely fail, it became a lesson in how quickly spiritual revolution can become a prison once leaders begin treating divine authority as permission to dominate every corner of human life. And that is why the Münster Anabaptist Kingdom still matters. It showed that a movement can begin with the language of rebirth and end by consuming an entire city in the name of purification. Once a group becomes convinced that it alone is building God's final order on earth, almost any cruelty can be recoded as necessity, and by the time the walls fall, the believers inside may no longer know whether they were defending paradise or dying inside a trap built from prophecy itself. Number 1. The People's Temple and Jonestown. Some destructive movements ruin lives slowly. Others end in spectacle so horrifying that the name of the place becomes shorthand for total cult catastrophe. Jonestown stands at number 1 because it did not merely reveal one failed community. It revealed with unbearable clarity what happens when charisma, fear, isolation, political idealism, dependency, and apocalyptic siege mentality are allowed to harden into one closed world with no exit left inside it. The People's Temple did not begin as a movement that looked doomed. Under Jim Jones, it presented itself through some of the most seductive language any destructive movement can use: equality, justice, racial integration, communal care, and moral seriousness in a world full of hypocrisy. That is part of what makes the story so devastating. The movement did not recruit through obvious darkness. It recruited through hope, through the promise that a better society could actually be built if enough people committed themselves fully. But full commitment is exactly where danger enters. Once a leader becomes the emotional, moral, and practical center of reality, every good instinct a movement began with can be redirected. Care becomes surveillance. Sacrifice becomes obedience. Solidarity becomes isolation. Criticism becomes betrayal. The People's Temple gradually evolved into precisely that kind of system, one in which Jones's authority swallowed the very ideals that had made the movement attractive in the first place. The relocation to Guyana intensified every destructive pattern already present. Distance matters in cult history. The farther a movement can remove people from ordinary support networks, legal scrutiny, and informal correction, the more total its internal atmosphere can become. Jonestown was not simply a commune in the jungle. It was an engineered social environment where exhaustion, dependency, fear, rehearsed emergency thinking, and the leader's declining instability could reinforce one another without relief. The movement no longer needed to persuade in the ordinary sense. It could condition. This is what made the final catastrophe possible. By the time Congressman Leo Ryan arrived and events spiraled toward open violence, Jonestown was already psychologically structured for disaster. The murders at the airstrip mattered not only because they were shocking, but because they revealed how far the movement had crossed into siege mentality. After that, the mass death that followed was not the sudden invention of a single terrible day. It was the culmination of a long internal process in which the community had been taught to see death, especially so-called revolutionary death, as preferable to surrender, betrayal, or life under the enemy's control. That final scene remains one of the bleakest in modern history. Children dead, families destroyed, adults persuaded, pressured, trapped, or broken into participating in mass death under the language of principle and inevitability. The phrase, "drinking the Kool-Aid," has cheapened the memory in public culture, but the reality was not dark irony. It was the annihilation of human judgment inside a system that had steadily eroded people's ability to imagine a future outside the leader's voice. And that is why Jonestown stands at number 1. It is not simply the most famous cult disaster. It is the clearest demonstration of how a movement can begin with social conscience and end in industrialized despair when one man's authority becomes absolute, when the community becomes physically and mentally sealed, and when belief is no longer a source of meaning but a total environment from which even death begins to look like logic. Jonestown endures because it forces history to confront the most painful truth about ruin born from belief. People do not have to enter such systems seeking destruction. They can enter seeking justice, dignity, belonging, and hope. The catastrophe comes later, when the thing that once looked like salvation has already become the only world they are allowed to believe is real.